Hi, this is an S-Play skills video on how to set up a triggered show on your device that does not keep cycling every time the trigger is activated. A good example of this case where this would be required is if you're working on a project where there is a sensor or a button accessible to the general public that is meant to trigger a show. If people keep walking past this sensor or keep pressing the button, then the show would keep starting over as often as the trigger was being activated. Depending on the lights and the surroundings, this could result in the lights flashing repeatedly or uncomfortably snapping back to the start. To start this off, I'm going to head to my S-Play's playlist tab. I've already got a effect queue that will be forming my show. Yours can be static cues, dynamic cues, or a mix of all three. And I have a digital input trigger which will be forming my start trigger, and that's labeled here as button on. So normally to do this triggered show, we would drag in our cue, start from the start, and then set our start trigger to our button, and then set the play count to 1. And by doing this, we make a playlist that when we press the button, plays through once, will stop. The problem with that is that every time we press the button, it would snap back to the start because the start trigger is set to that button on. How we go about changing this so that we have a setup that doesn't repeatedly snap back to the start is we change this part, so the start trigger has to be set to either no trigger, or what I'll do is on power up, and I'll need a play count of infinity. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the function of the S-Play's playlist where I can drag triggers into the timeline. And what I'm going to do then is set my effect, or set my cue to start a fraction of a second after the start of the timeline, 20 milliseconds here as the start of my cue, and my button trigger I'm going to set at 1 millisecond. So if I save that, what this achieves is that when the S-Play powers up, the S-Play will run this playlist, and what you can see is happening here is as soon as the playlist is run, it hits the timeline trigger block and it pauses there. And it's paused in a position that is before the test effect, so it's currently still playing nothing, and then once the button is pressed, it continues and then plays through the effect. And because of the infinite loop, once it gets to the end, it loops back to the start, and again it holds on the trigger block, which is again before the effect cue. And so one trigger press means that the show will play through once, and repeated trigger presses during this time will not repeatedly set the show off again and again and flash back to the start.